Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Terrible Tabletop Tutorials from the Corona Quarantine Kitchen. And today, nothing on the table, no tutorials when it comes to photography. I'm your host, MD Welch, and hopefully you haven't hit the close button yet on this, because as you can see with the text at the top, we're going to talk about resolution. I know, so exciting, right? Resolution. And to be honest with you, there's nothing exciting about resolution, but it is one of those necessary evils to understand as a digital photographer. And even if you're an analog photographer and you're scanning your images in and then you're digitally outputting or sending those to a digital printer, it's important to understand how resolution works. And I will say it is shocking how little most people really understand resolution. And I think it's because it is a very intimidating subject. There's a lot of numbers involved. There's a lot of experimentation, and it can throw people for a loop. So what I'm going to try to do is in short of a period as possible. And by the way, this is the second time we've recorded this video because the last one was like 45 minutes long. I'm like, I got to start over. I'm going to try to break down resolution for you in as simple a way as possible and also give you a little bit of information about resolution. Now, first of all, I do think it's important to point out that not that long ago, and I'll make this a little bit bigger, I was a graphics designer well before being a photographer as a profession at least, and I managed a 6-foot wide printer at my shop. And this is before large printers were really accessible for most people. So I was a kid in a candy store. I had to get a paper vendor show up. They give me free rolls of paper like 10 feet long. My boss didn't care because I was always maintaining the printer so I could make prints. And I would also use other vendors for larger prints because we did a lot of signage. So the largest print that I've ever made is 8 feet tall by 40 feet long, which is this thing that you see unrolled in the parking lot, which was a backdrop to use at Burning Man many, many years ago. So let's talk a little bit about resolution. And I will say there a reason why there's so much confusion about resolution is not only can it be intimidating, but there's a lot of urban myths out there, a lot of urban legends about resolution that are just not true. And it usually happens because one person is passing down information to another person and they got that information from somebody else. And at the end of the day, they're just regurgitating what they've been told, and rarely do people experiment. Do they work outside of the box? And you can experiment. Even if you don't own a printer, you could definitely do this experimentation on your own. There's so many vendors that you could send stuff off to. So let's talk about a little bit of the urban legends and an urban myths about resolution and work our way through this process. First important thing to point out that resolution doesn't necessarily equal quality. It is a part of how good the quality of a print can be, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it means quality. I've heard people say, oh, high resolution images are high quality prints. Not necessarily true. You could have an out of focus, badly composed, over compressed image that's at the right resolution and it looks terrible. Resolution is part of image quality. It is not image quality exactly. So I want to say that because I hear a lot of people put way too much emphasis on resolution when it comes to quality. You'll be amazed what you could do with a 6 to 8 megapixel image. If it was sharp, if it was captured well, if the colors are well done, if it hasn't been over compressed, so you still have the camera raw or PSD file from it, you can get a lot out of small images, as you're going to see as we progress through this video. The next thing we want to mention is that 300 pixels per inch is not a standard. If you don't know what pixels per inch or PPI is, we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But PPI is a way to measure resolution on a digital device. DPI is a way to measure resolution on a inkjet printer, dots per inch. And LPI, lines per inch, is how offset or CMYK presses measure their resolution. For a long period of time, people were just told 300 pixels per inch. Just give me the file, 300 pixels per inch, and that's what they ran with. And the honest to God's truth is most printers now, especially newer printers, don't need that high of a resolution to make that high of an output or quality of print. The numbers don't have to match up. In fact, newer devices are doing more with less information. So that's an important thing to point out. A lot of times you're told 300 pixels per inch from somebody because that's what somebody told them, and that's what somebody that told somebody else. You get the idea. It's a lot of bad passed down information, and people just don't take the time to do tests, which I'm going to show you how to do a test as well to figure out what right PPI for what device is best for you. Next is don't work in the dark. So have as much information as possible before you start to really play around with resolution. Resolution doesn't make a lot of sense unless there's a target to shoot for. So if you're just opening up a window and you're changing resolution, it doesn't make a lot of sense to do that. Trust your vendors. experiment on your own printer. Do understand there are some vendors who, to be honest with you, really don't know. The aforementioned Walgreens and Costco, which by the way, get a lot of bad rap. I'm going to do another video on Costco printing later on. Those individuals running those printers a lot of times don't understand the technology, know how to maintain it, they know how to output it, they know how to charge you for it. But you call them up and you're like, hey, I'm going to do a 12 by 18. What does my minimum resolution need to be? They're probably going to regurgitate something that's on a card, taped to the side of the machine. So sometimes you have to do a little bit of research. But long story short, you're not going to play around with resolution without having some information beforehand. And again, we're going to talk more about that as we progress in the video. All output devices are different, by the way. So one resolution requirement for one type of printer might be different than another device. Also, really large printers don't require nearly the same amount of resolution. If for nothing more, like for example, a billboard printer, you're not going to be right on top of a billboard print and evaluating the quality of it, or a wall mural. You're going to be standing feet, if not maybe 100 or 200 feet away from really large prints before you see the entirety of the print. So a lot of times you don't need as much information to make a large size print. Interestingly enough, a 10 megapixel image is usually just fine for a bus or a billboard print. You don't need a lot of information, and we'll talk more about that again as we progress through this video. And one of the last things I want to point out, a high quality print, even if it's relatively low resolution, say 6 megapixels, 10 megapixels, can do a lot more than a not so good 12 megapixel image. So don't think that those great images that you took back in the day with your high-end D1X Nikon are useless because there was only whatever a D1X was, 6, 8 megapixels. The quality that came out of the camera was pretty amazing. And a lot of times when an image breaks down, it breaks down in very small, fine details. And that might not be, a deal breaker for when you're printing out with that particular digital file. And last, and most importantly, if you're going to hand off prints to somebody else, always trust your vendors, work with vendors. I always send off some test prints. I'm going to give you some test cases in a moment. And I see how a vendor works. I don't send a really important job to a vendor for the first time out. If you're about to handle or trust somebody with some of your printing, send them, do one print, something, almost like a throwaway kind of thing, and see how their service is, see how their responses are, what information they give you, how that kind of plays into account with your output of whatever print that you're actually doing. And do keep in mind, we are talking a lot about printing here, but I'm going to also talk about digital in just a few moments. And you're like, when are these other things that you're going to talk about going to happen? They're going to happen right now. So first order of business, I'm going to open up a 12 megapixel file. This was shot on the original Canon 5D, one of my favorite cameras that I've ever owned. Probably shot more with this particular model of camera than any other camera that I have owned before or since. It was just a workhorse. And this is one of my favorite pictures I've ever taken it, my late dog Yoshi. But this is also my test file for printing. One thing I will say before we get too deep into resolution is go out and find an image that has a lot of detail in it. And pictures of dogs or cats are great for this because of the fur, all these little small details. These things are going to break apart first. And it's always easy to kind of evaluate that quality. In the case of this image, I've actually found as I start to play around with the resolution and that resolution starts to become too low to give me proper output, that the text on these dog tags will actually start to become fuzzy, will become hard to read. So find an image, get an image, kind of get it all ready, and use that as your master image there. You could always make copies of it, different resolutions to send out to do a test and work through that. So I'm in Adobe Photoshop, if you haven't already guessed that by now. And there's a lot of programs out there that will change resolution, but most people use this inside of Adobe Photoshop. There's also several different places to change resolution or image size inside of Photoshop as well. But I'm going to use the good old-fashioned one that will allow you not only to know what your resolution is, but also allow you to change your resolution. And that is found on the menu bar underneath Image to image size. Now, when you open up this window, a lot of people get, almost like upset stomachs when they open up this window, because this window can be a lot. It can be intimidating. So let's walk through this. This window does two things for us. One, it tells us the current size of the image. And by the way, sometimes people will say image size and they mean resolution, or they'll say resolution and they mean image size. They're almost synonyms, but not really. So this will tell you your image size or your current resolution, as well as let you change it and also see the repercussions for that change as you do this. Now, there's a few things to ignore or are not that big of a deal. At the very top is image size, which it currently says 36 megabytes. This is not 36 megabytes. This is just 36 megabytes of uncompressed data, right? And it's 36 megabytes based upon the dimensions, which are listed down here at such and such pixels by such and such pixels, 4,300-ish pixels by almost 3,000 pixels. An important thing to point out, computers, digital cameras, scanners, projectors, television sets, cinema screens do not care about pixels per inch. They don't care about dots per inch. They only care about pixel width by pixel height. That's why if you send a 1920 by 1080 image to a good old-fashioned HD monitor, it doesn't matter if it's 72, 96, 120 pixels, it's still going to display because that device displays by pixel width by pixel height. So if you ever open up this window and you're resizing graphics digitally, really what you're going to pay attention to is pixel width by pixel height. Believe it or not, resolution doesn't have that big of an impact. There are some programs, there are some instances that people will, that 72 pixels per inch, which is digital resolution, which is, again, not really correct. So when I size things down, I still give people the resolution at 72 pixels per inch, even though that I know it has no output or bearing on the quality of an image on a digital device. So this is the original dimensions. This is what a 12 megapixel image is. Take 4,300-ish by 300-ish, 3,000-ish pixels, and slam those together, that's like 12 megapixels. The next feature down here at the bottom is Fit To, which I never use simply because it doesn't usually have a big impact in how I work. These are just presets here on how to do this. You could kind of do your own presets. You could save them down here at the bottom if you wanted to. If you're into presets, there you go. I usually find that I'm kind of one-offing just about everything. I don't print that much, so I don't use presets that much. So use that, don't use it, but I'm not going to go over Fit To any more than just saying that's where Fit To's at. What I want to focus on is the next three fields, the width, the height, and the resolution. The width and the height are relatively straightforward. If I was to hit print right now, I would get an 18 by 12-ish print. Of course, having a printer that can print that large with a large enough piece of paper in there, I'd get 18 by 12 at a resolution of 240 pixels per inch. Now, 240 is kind of a default resolution for Canon cameras. Out of camera, some cameras will actually open up in this window at 72 pixels per inch. I will show you how to work around that feature in Lightroom and in Capture One at the end of this video, and then actually have it come in at maybe a resolution you'd want it to start with. Important thing to point out, the changing of the resolution, as you're about to see, doesn't really change the pixel dimensions, the original information of the image. So I have width and height, and then I have the resolution. And down at the bottom, there is this checkbox. And this resample checkbox is really the secret to conquering the image size window. What you're going to do when you open up this window, again, you're not working in the dark. So I'm going to throw out some hypothetical numbers here based upon experience. But you really don't want to open up this window and start changing numbers unless you know either A, what the numbers need to be, or B, that you know that you're doing a test and you're setting things up so you could figure out what the numbers need to be, say for your own printer. And by the way, this isn't a bad thing to do. You get that new printer out of the box, start printing up some 8x10s. How low can you go on your particular print device? So this is the way to operate image size. Again, we're going to have some numbers here, so we're not working in the dark. But step number one is uncheck resample image. Notice that the width and the height and resolution now all are connected with this little link of chain, meaning if I change one value, it will change the other values proportionally. If I check resample image, notice that that little link of chain now only applies to width and height. Now, resample is just a very fancy computer way to say add or subtract pixels. If you uncheck resample image, what you're forcing Photoshop to do is resize the image with only the original information, meaning you're not going to get rid of any data, nor are you going to add any data. So the original size of the image stays intact. And by the way, you're about to realize why you should have paid attention in high school physics. Let's say, for example, we're going to use that mythical number of 300 pixels per inch. If I highlight resolution with resample unchecked and type in 300, Notice how the width and the height decrease. The dimensions up here at the top, 4,300-ish by almost 3,000-ish pixels, have not changed at all. But the width and the height in print have. Because what we've done is we've said, let's increase the density of those pixels. We've increased the density. When you increase the density, you usually have a decrease in volume. Or when you decrease the volume, you increase density. By the way, if at some particular point, you probably should think about writing your high school physics teacher and apologizing for telling him you're never going to use that information, because here it is, right? And conversely, if all of a sudden I said, well, I don't need it to be as high as 300, I could go as low as 150, watch what happens to the width and height. All of a sudden it jumps up. Now, when I was operating a large format printer, I knew that I could go as low as 150 with no problem. I also knew that I could go as low as 100 and rarely see anything break apart. So if a client brought in an image, I would open up image size. If they said, well, I need it to be such and such feet by such and such feet, I would open it up inside of Photoshop, open up image size, and type in a resolution of 100, and I could tell them exactly how big I can make that print with no loss of quality. Could I print it larger? Yes, but I would always say anything larger than this, we're not responsible for what happens to the file at that particular point. Because here's the downside with the large format printing. You actually kind of have to just print it to see what's going to happen in a lot of particular cases. So knowing what your resolution is has a huge impact on how large you're going to be able to print. Large format printers, really big ones, say like those billboard printers, can go to 50 or even as low as 25 pixels per inch, which is how I made 8 feet by 40 feet. So knowing what the resolution needs to be is critical to understanding this window. And that's why not understanding what your resolution is, it means that opening up this window is actually useless, right? But if you knew that it needed to be 300, great. Now you know you could go 14 and a half by a little over 9.5, and that's going to give you a print. By the way, really important thing to point out, that doesn't mean you can't resize this image. You could resize in Photoshop, you could resize in other programs, meaning that you can interpolate or add pixels to the image. Just understand that the quality of the image might be sacrificed when you do that. It has a lot to do with the original image quality, as well as the software and the algorithms that are going behind it. I'm not going to get too deep into that here because, again, I'm trying to keep this video short, which is getting out of control as I speak. So 14.5 by a little over 9.5 at 300 pixels per inch. So let's review. Step number 1 is come in and make sure that resample is unchecked. Step number 2 is input the resolution that you need, or if you're doing a test, what you're trying to do for that particular test. After that particular point, you could then check resample image. Right now I have 14 by 9 at 300 pixels per inch, and I could come into here. So let's say that I wanted to do an 8 by 10 or an 8 by 12 in this case because of crop. I always match the lower number to the lower number. So 8 by 10, I'll highlight the 9, change it to 8, and there's my 8 by 12. Now I do want to point out, because I checked resample, now I am subtracting or adding pixels. Notice now that the original image size was 36 megabytes. Now it's 24. The dimensions have also dropped as well. I have removed pixels from this image. Let's say that it didn't need to be a height of 8. And by the way, this is a good time to point out a nice keyboard shortcut when you're playing around with this window. On the Mac, if you hold down Option, or on Windows, if you hold down the Alt key, the cancel button in this window will turn to reset. So you can just reset this without hitting cancel here. By the way, that works for most Windows and most Adobe programs. So let's say in this particular case, I'll uncheck resample image. I'll go back to 300. And I'll check resample. Let's say the height here can't be 9. It needs to be, let's say 16, right? I'll highlight this and type in 16. Now I'm adding pixels to this. Be very careful. When you add pixels in Photoshop, that's where you have the most potential of seeing a loss of image quality here. There's a lot that goes into this. Original image quality is a big part of it. Also, how many pixels that you add. As a rule, I try to not double up the number. So in this case, it was 9, I believe, and I went to 16. So I really wouldn't go much higher than 18 with any sort of confidence. If I had to go higher than that, I would probably look at a third-party program. So now we've covered this again. And again, quick review. I'll reset this. I uncheck resample, hit my resolution, type in 300, check resample, and then hit my width or my height. And by the way, if the ratio isn't correct for the image, that's where the crop tool comes into play here. You would go in and you would crop off. So in this case, if I'm doing an 8:10, I type in 8, I'm going to have a width of 12 here. I got to go grab the crop tool and trim that off. And I've already done a little bit of video work on the crop tool. And again, I don't want to go too much deeper into this or too much longer. So I have inputted the correct resolution. Now I have 8:12 here. The last process is selecting the correct algorithm. Now, the good news is there's an automatic setting now in Photoshop, so if you forget, you're probably okay. But there is some options here that you could go in a little bit deeper. There's preserve details for enlargement, and there's preserve details 2.0 for enlargement. These first three items here actually have everything to do with enlargement. So enlargement means that you've gone from an image size of, say, 36 to, say, 42, right? That is technically an enlargement because you are adding pixels to the image. Bicubic Sharper is for a reduction, and this is a reduction. Even though that maybe I have changed the resolution, which made the size bigger, if I'm reducing this number, so if it's no longer 36 and it's now 24, this is a reduction, and I'm going to use Bicubic Sharper. And by the way, there's only one for reduction, so that makes it really easy. And thank goodness that Adobe finally put these in parentheses a few years ago. There's a few other ones for smooth gradients or hard edges. If you're a landscape photographer, you may find that you get some banding, especially if you enlarge things, so you might choose Bicubic for smooth gradients. And again, this involves a little bit of playing around with your Photoshop files for more complicated images here. And nobody uses bilinear anymore. I don't even know why they include it on here. So again, let's go back and review. Always uncheck resample image. Get your resolution inputted first. Check resample. If your size here, your width and height obviously is larger than you need it to be, hurrah, you don't have to worry about it. If it's within range and you only have to increase it a little bit, you're probably okay. If it's significant, be prepared for a loss of quality, but you probably won't know until you actually test it out. In this case, I'm going to do an 8:12 here at a resolution of 300. And then of course, the last step is I'll set Bicubic for a reduction. Right? So even though this video is really, really long, this is just a couple of steps to figure out how big things need to be. Now, when I click OK, what's going to happen is it will make a reduction to this image. It actually gets a little bit smaller. Why? Because I reduced pixels here. But if I go back up to image and I go to image size, I will see that I have a 12:8 at 300 pixels per inch. Now, small little addition here. If you are doing a set of tests, if you're trying to figure out with a particular vendor how low that you can go, or you're doing your own printing testing, what you could do is set the same size. Now, 8:12 might be a little too big, especially if it's your own printer. Maybe you don't want to waste that ink, so you could go smaller than that. If you're going to go smaller, maybe you're printing out a section because you want to still be able to concentrate on detail. But what you could do is save this image, call it 8:12 at 300 ... JPEG or something like that, and then you could open them up back the original here and say, well, I'm going to do one at 250. And of course, you're leaving resample checked here because what you're trying to do is just lower the resolution and keep the same size. So you could do a series here from 300 to 250 to 200 to 150 to 100. You get the idea. When I do this, I will actually, just to make sure I keep everything straight, I will actually put a text field over the photo. So when I print this out, I could actually line these up and I could see, oh, this is 300, this is 250. Obviously, change the text field when you change the resolution and save it as a copy or a new file. Don't oversave JPEGs, by the way, because JPEG compression will cause a loss of quality. If you're saving over a JPEG and over a JPEG, by the time you get to 100, no matter how good the quality might be, you're going to see that quality disappear. So this is how you handle image resolution. And this is how you can start to test out image resolution. Again, it's not as complicated as it needs to be, especially if you're not working in the dark. Just use image size. Make sure you have these answers before you open up this window. Remember the steps. Uncheck resample image, change your resolution, then check resample image, and then go ahead and make your changes as you need to. And again, if the width or the height is a little too much, that's where you're going to go ahead and grab the crop tool. So a couple of quick things to wrap up this video. If you're working in a Lightroom workflow or Capture One workflow, you may find from time to time when you open up the images, resolutions don't really look the same. Keep in mind that neither Lightroom or Capture One, unless you tell them to through an export window, are going to change the resolutions. They're going to keep the file size, the original size, when you bring it into Photoshop. But if you want to kind of make sure that you have the right settings, the easiest thing to do, I'll show you Lightroom first. I'm in Lightroom Classic. You're going going to go into preferences, and then you're going to come into the preferences window. You're going to go to external editing, and you could choose your file format, your color space, and your bit depth. These three dropdowns are hypercritical for success inside of Photoshop or Photoshop to Lightroom or Lightroom to Photoshop workflow. In fact, I highly recommend these exact settings here, which I will have to do more videos on why that is. Maybe TIFF over PSD would be the only thing that you would change. But the resolution here, by just inputting 300, all that means is when you open up image size inside of Photoshop, it has the resolution already set to 300. So if you know that 300 is your baseline, you could go ahead and have that automatically be set up when you come into image size. So for those of you who have that weird camera that when you open it up in Photoshop, it's always like 72 pixels per inch, and your document size is like 45 inches by 36 inches or something like that, you can negate that and have Photoshop display it at 300 pixels per inch. But take note that it does not change this inside of this window. And by the way, that is using the edit in feature inside of Lightroom and then editing it inside of Photoshop. If you use the export window and you change the resolution there, you are sizing the image down by using export. For those of you in the Capture One format, if you right click over an image, you could choose Edit With. And in this case, I'll choose Adobe Photoshop 2020. And Capture One is a little bit different because you could change it on a file by file basis, but it's pretty much the exact same window here. You have your format, you have your ICC profile, you have your resolution. The only difference is, and oh yeah, by the way, bit depth up here, I'm going to make sure that's 16-bit, by the way. The resolution here at 300 pixels per inch is exactly like Lightroom. The only difference is that Capture One does give you the option to scale this down on export. My small side note would be don't do that. Edit the original image inside of Photoshop, have that big image, and then scale it down for export later on. So I hope this answers and demystifies some of the confusion about resolution for those of you who maybe are still struggling with this. This might also help you out for those of you who are thinking about buying, do I need 40 megapixels? Do I need 60 megapixels? For example, this is a 62 megapixel image here. If I go into image size, you could see already at 300 pixels per inch, it's almost 3 feet wide by almost 2 feet tall here. So if I was to make this say 200 pixels per inch, let's uncheck resample. I'm going to follow my own instructions here and set this to maybe 200 pixels per inch. I'm almost 4 feet wide. So, having more megapixels means you could do larger prints, or maybe even more importantly, that you could do tighter crops. So you could shoot a little bit looser and you could come into there. So understanding the image size window will also have an impact over maybe how you compose images outside of Adobe Photoshop and get more not only out of your photography, but out of your post-production process, as well as eventually, hopefully, your final print. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, share this with friends or colleagues who may be interested in this particular subject or some of the other videos that are on my channel. I hope you are healthy. I hope your friends and your family are healthy as well. Some areas of the country are starting to open up a little bit. So if you're out there shooting, please be safe, and I wish you all the best.